Thank you for being with us, guys. See a lot of familiar faces for some of our earlier uh, Zooms that we've done, where when we created Vices, we really set out to create a new way that people would develop relationships with the people that make the coolest things in the world. And it is our pleasure on a monthly basis to, find stories to tell and new experiences to have that will introduce you to things that are inspiring, that'll broaden your horizons, help you adopt a few new vices, of course, all the good kind. And one of the things that we've been planning on doing quite a bit more is actually getting together. Our whole ethos around Vices is getting together in celebration. And it just so happens it's not something that we can easily do right now. Of course, it seems like we're getting to the other side of that tunnel, and we do hope to be doing some in-person events very soon. But in the meantime, this has been a great format where not only can we tell these stories through the book, through the box, but we're really excited for you guys to get a chance to see and meet the people behind these wonderful things that we've discovered and that we've had the pleasure of sending to your living room. Penfolds is, for many of you have experienced the brand in one form or another. This is a very special brand. Absolutely one of my favorites, but it is without a doubt one of the most iconic and important names in winemaking. And like any wine, there's so much that goes into it, but what makes wine so special is the human element. We get to enjoy it together, and it broadens the in-person experiences that we have with one another. But that connection with these amazing people that make the wine is one of the things that make it, I think, just one of our favorite luxury products. And today we're really excited to introduce you to Steph Dutton, who's going to take over in a little while. Who we're grateful to be with us because it is 8:30 in the morning her time in Australia. She has literally just, I don't know if you were in the barreling room or if you were actually in the fields, but they're finishing up harvest, they're bottling wine. But Steph, head winemaker at Penfolds, has graced us with her presence, and we're really excited to have you, Steph.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm already 200 wines into the morning, but remarkably fresh, hopefully. So I love being here with you guys.
And without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce you to Charlotte Rawa, our dear friend, who is the U.S. Fine Wine Ambassador for Penfolds and family of brands. Charlotte, can you kick things off and let's drink some wine and learn a little bit?
Absolutely. Well, so for those of you who do not yet have wine in your glass, please pour a sip or a glass, however much you wish. Very, very good. Of Bin 600, because that's the wine we're going to start with. Wow, we're really excited to be here this evening with you to actually talk to you live about what you received in your box. As some of you may have heard earlier that I mentioned, we started talking about this back in November, and it was a bit of serendipity because I happened to meet someone from Vices at an event that I was doing, and it just sounded so wonderful and interesting that the conversation took off, and the fact that we were about to release the inaugural collection of our wines from California, just it all seemed to fall in place like moon and stars. So very excited for this. And as you know, the box is themed Extraordinary Risk. And it wouldn't be Penfolds without us starting at the beginning of 177 years ago, a 177-year journey that brings us here today with Steph. And Steph is our senior red winemaker. She spent a lot of time over the last several years here with us in Napa, working on these wines. I would say they're sort of a manifest destiny, something incredible. So we'll begin with Bin 600, which is one of the wines from the California collection. And we'll also taste this evening one of our most famous wines, most collected wines, but what we would call, I think, the sister of Bin 600, so Bin 389. So again, you cannot tell the Penfolds story, for those of you who are fairly new to us or those who might need a refresher, without talking about the founding of the winery. And when we talk about extraordinary risk, we talk about Mary and Christopher Penfold. And Dr. Penfold, who's just here on the right, and Mary, his wife, on the left, they took an extraordinary risk in their life, in their young lives. They left England and they sailed for over 3 months to South Australia, to the newly formed colony there in 1844. And the purpose of that journey, pioneers going to a place that they'd never seen before, starting a new life, and Dr. Penfold became the physician for that colony, 15,000 strong at that time. And this couple purchased a farm of 500 acres, planted vines, and built a cottage called the Grange Cottage. Now, you might be wondering why anyone would put together wine grapevines and medicine. And I'll tell you, if you think about it for a moment and you think about the timing, 1844, we didn't have penicillin, we didn't have Pepto-Bismol, we didn't have Tylenol. What we had was fortified wine, and that was Dr. Penfold's medicine. So the origin of Penfolds lies in those beautiful fortified wines, 5 of which we still make today. But you had to get there, and part of that was building the winery. So this picture shows you what it was really like to be a pioneer and take a risk. I would say those guys were probably taking a risk every single day to build the winery. And you can see no heavy equipment, just mules, hands, and carts. Today, you can see the historic winery here in this photograph in Adelaide, and that is where we make our most famous wine, which is called Grange, and obviously named after the Grange Cottage. This beautiful building, part of the winery, is on McGill Estate, and McGill Estate is that original farm. Moving on, you cannot discuss the Penfold story without talking about Max Schubert. And this is Max. Max is the creator of Grange, 1951, the first vintage. And, you know, he's a very interesting character, and so many books and articles have been written about him. I think he marked the transition between all of the history that brought Penfolds to 1951 and what was going to become, through his vision, the modern innovation of the winery. And Grange was the first still wine, still red wine of great acclaim that was made from Australia and from Penfolds. And it really set the stage for what we would become, and it laid the groundwork for where we are today with the wines that we're tasting tonight. So this sort of segues into today. Bin 600 in your glass, part of this brand new inaugural collection. You all are among the first on the planet to try this wine. And you know, 30 years in the making, over 30 years. And what we're doing is we're combining 2 hemispheres. So we start with Australia. Here on the left, the picture of the larger island, which of course, some of you may know, is the same landmass as the United States, minus Hawaii and Alaska. Very large. Also the driest and the hottest on the globe. So the zoom in on the right gives you our wine country, meaning Penfolds wine country. You can see there in the red, that is our winery in Barossa Valley. And then just down, there's a little bullet that shows you McGill Estate. So about maybe a little over an hour south. And then the other hemisphere, the Northern Hemisphere, here in California. So the wine we're going to talk about with Steph is Napa, appellated, as well as Paso Robles. And with that, please take a sip. And I want to introduce you to Steph. Like all of those of us who work at Penfolds, we all have an interesting journey and story for how we got here. All of those stories are aspirational. And you know, Steph, when she was getting her master's degree in enology, began working at the cellar door in Adelaide. And now that was 2007. Now, all these years later, you know, she's making the inaugural collection from California. So Steph, we're beginning with Cabernet Shiraz. Tell us how this wine came to be. What was the inspiration? What makes it so special?
Thanks, Charlotte. Sometimes when you're looking at a wine like Bin 600, you don't know exactly where to start. And I'm grateful that you began in 1844 because it saves me going right back to the very beginning. And I'll probably talk a little bit about what's been happening, some changes, some future forward thinking that's been going on more so in the past 20 years, which is still a significant time period. I remember when I started with Penfolds back in 2007, so that is now 14 years ago. I remember I was probably in my early 20s at the time, and my predecessor, our previous senior winemaker, Steve Leonard, was my boss. And I remember in these winery walls, quite literally stumbling across a bottle of wine that had written on it as a mock-up label, nothing finished, Paso Robles Shiraz. And I remember almost 14 years ago saying to my predecessor, why is Penfolds on a label with Paso Robles, Camata Hills, which was the name of the vineyard, and what does that mean? And Steve was a beautiful guy. He retired only a couple of years ago after 39 consecutive vintages, but he also had the mentality, why would I tell somebody in 5 minutes what it took me 5 years to learn? He had that approach that you always got the right amount of information at the right time, exactly when you needed it. And he was always very good at protecting the craft and the IP. And this little element of something that the textbooks couldn't teach, only experience could give you, to the people that had served long apprenticeships. And over the next couple of years, probably from 2007 to 2012, little bits of the California story started to emerge and they were shared with me. He reminded me that back in the late 1990s, we had what we refer to as a heritage selections program happening here in Australia. And where I'm sitting at the moment is probably about 10 minutes away from our Kalimna vineyard, one of our largest and most famous vineyards here in South Australia. And we purchased it in 1945, but it's home to some of the oldest producing Cabernet in the world. In fact, we say it is the oldest continually producing Cabernet in the world, dating back to the 1880s. But I always say that with a little bit of trepidation because I have no proof. And I'm waiting for the day that somebody says, no, I know of older continually producing Cabernet. It wasn't the first to go in the ground, but obviously it predates phylloxera and therefore making it some of the oldest genetic material that's still producing. And at that vineyard and at McGill Estate, we were selecting not only our best performing vineyards, but our best performing blocks. And not only our best performing blocks, but our best performing rows. And not only our best performing rows, but tagging the very best producing vines that were balanced and creating fruit of the highest quality. And we were actually harvesting that genetic material and propagating more and more stock of it. At the same time, in the late 1990s, we had acquired a block over in California in Paso Robles. And when people ask why, I think the most accurate response I can give them is more of a why not. We were curious about other parts of the world. And as a global brand that had been operating in a truly global sense for decades, even predating the 1990s, we had been traveling the globe and identifying high-performing wine-producing regions and countries and admiring them for a long time. And as you mentioned before, when we looked at that map of Australia, Australia is, in terms of geography, not dissimilar to the land mass and the area that the US occupies. Yet our population, I think, is less than a tenth of what you have. We have been forced to operate globally for a very long period of time. And what it means is that we've been traveling for a very long period of time. And this acquisition of vineyard in the late 1990s, coupled with our propagation of high-performing genetic material, meant that, of course, we were going to be curious of what that material would do in the ground in California. And so when Steve was telling me these stories over time, all of a sudden, all I could hear was a great excuse as a winemaker to be traveling to the Northern Hemisphere almost every single year to continue harvesting that knowledge that we had quite literally planted in the ground at the time. Years and years later, I fast forward to 2015, and the unromantic side of the wine business is that mergers, acquisitions, demergers, and everything else in between are happening all the time. But in 2015, we acquired the Diageo wine business in the US. And the jewel in the crown of the Diageo wine business was, I think, incredible Napa Valley vineyards that were performing at the highest level and some of the most esteemed examples of Cabernet Sauvignon in the world. Now, as Penfolds winemakers, when we're going back and forth between the two hemispheres, not only do we have excellent Shiraz down in Paso Robles, but we have incredible Cabernet up in Napa Valley. We are a brand that has, I guess, promoted the craft of blending for over 175 years now. And at this point in time, as I said, from 2015 onwards, we have two varieties operating in two different regions, separated by a 4-hour drive. And all of a sudden, we can see the great potential that lies with bringing those two blending companions together. But you're right, you alluded to Cabernet and Shiraz coming together as almost puzzle pieces that complete each other and create something that is incredibly powerful, incredibly voluminous, and incredibly complete. And I think bringing together both Cabernet and Shiraz is famously, it's a quintessential Australian blend that we have championed for so long. And so it was only natural for us to want to see what these two varieties did in a different hemisphere, in a different country, in the state of California. And that is, I guess, the backstory to Bin 600 in as succinct form as I can possibly manage.
Well, I think you did a great job of answering my question. I think we should all do a great job of taking another sip. And I'd like for you to tell us all what you think the highlights are in this wine. It's quite remarkable. It's had such a remarkable reception, especially here in the US. And you know, I always like to hear from you what you think, what you're most proud of about the wine.
For me, house style is a term that is not only used in the wine industry, but house style is a term that's really important to many luxury brands. And, you know, you call out the fashion industry, they refer to house style on a regular basis. I see house style possibly in the most pronounced way in the automotive industry. I say to people, if you take the badge off cars, you can still tell who the producer of that car is because there's a distinctive shape, there's a distinctive quality, there's a distinctive aesthetic to what lies beneath. And the same can be said, as I said, in fashion, interiors, fine arts, and of course the wine industry. House style is important and it's something to be nurtured and it's something to be championed. I certainly consider myself and my colleagues custodians of this house style. It's a recognizability of Penfolds wines that can always be relied on, can always be counted on. However, what was really important to us when we were crafting Bin 600 is to, of course, have a Penfolds lens to how we were doing things, but also embrace all of the hero elements that are a part of California as a sense of place. And we get the benefit of both all of the hero elements of Paso Robles and the hero elements of Napa coming together to combine and I guess amplify each other. And so when I look at what's in the glass for Bin 600, I see the house style hallmarks of dark fruit And by dark fruit, I mean quince, I mean fig, I mean blackberry, blackcurrant, but also the complexity of a lot of food-derived aromas and tastes. And sometimes they might be by way of roast meats. I talk about pan scrapings, almost those roast juices that concentrate over time and give something that's incredibly generous by way of flavor. I often talk about the toastiness and the nuttiness that comes with barrel ferment. And we can touch on that a little bit later if you like. But barrel ferment, again, is a really important contributor to house style. And barrel ferment for me almost gives that hazelnut, chocolate, mocha-like character that comes through in the wine. And I see all of those in abundance in bin 600. I often use the analogy, given that we are looking at something that is a blend, at a time, I might add, when single vineyard and single origin is incredibly in fashion and in style. The best analogy that I can use to promote the virtues of both single vineyard or single origin and, of course, the philosophy of blending is thinking of it as a choir versus a solo artist. And when you have a choir, you have many voices singing all together at one point in time to create something that is full of volume, complete, and of course, harmony when done correctly. In saying that, if you have a solo artist and you were to put them into a choir, you would dilute that magic and that talent that you had in the first place. And our job as winemakers is to work out not only when to blend, but also when not to blend at the same time. And bin 600 is a great example, I think, of our conviction to a blend that is incredibly complete and more than simply the sum of all parts.
So some people, to add on to this, some people may be wondering, when we like to say that this wine is California sunshine above and California soil below and everything Penfolds in between. It really speaks to everything from viticulture to winemaking technique. We've got a couple of photos to just illustrate the point. Similarities in topography and climate. So Connor, if you can flip through the two vineyard shots that we have here. So there's Kamada Hills. This is the Creston 600 ranch that Steph was mentioning, purchased in 1998. One of the things that astounded me was that we actually brought the viticultural technique that we use in South Australia in planting and managing this vineyard. Here you can see Adelaide there in the background, those beautiful lights, and of course the beautiful Shiraz plants there just in the foreground. So cuttings from those mother vines ending up in Kamada Hills. And then if we move forward a couple of more, we'll see what I like to call the classic, the hallmark of Penfolds winemaking. So Steph, I wonder if you might add a little color here around what this is, and of course the next slide too, which has to do with barrels and the cooperage that we use for these wines as well.
As soon as I start talking about house style, everybody wants me to sum up what house style is in a sentence and what contributes to house style. And again, think about it in other industries. To try and do this in one sentence, sometimes even one paragraph, is really, really difficult because it's complex and there's a whole lot of variables. But I'm going to try and give it a shot. When I talk about house style, Penfolds is known for a dark fruit flavored profile. It is known for mid-palate generosity and sweetness. It is known to be texturally elegant, but at the same time with structural tannins that set a wine up for longevity and ageability. In terms of the exact personality that make it distinctive and really easy to pick in a glass when it's in front of you, there is a little element of something that you can't describe or put into words, but it almost triggers something in your memory bank. It's this recall ability to be that familiar and consistent that you know that it is Penfolds house style. All of the things that contribute to that I guess we just witnessed in the pictures that you just scrolled through. The way the vineyards are run from a viticultural point of view, the way that we make the wine by way of concrete open fermenters with wax-lined wooden headed down boards. Now, what you can see in this picture at the moment, people ask what heading down boards are. Think of them like floorboards that submerge the cap, which is the skins, into the fermenting liquid in this open fermenter. So what ends up happening is sitting underneath the surface are these floorboards, and you'll see little rows of carbon dioxide bubbles that are just coming up through the gaps, in between the slats, I guess, of the heading down boards. All of these sorts of things, I'm not going to say that they're unique to Penfolds. I will say we're probably the most famous example of utilizing heading down boards. But when you couple that with barrel fermentation, which is in the next slide, plus our way of picking, our timing of picking, our way of running a vineyard, all of those sorts of things, they do combine together to create your truly unique story and your truly unique way of working. Barrel fermentation is basically coming off skins before the wine is sugar dry and pressing to barrel, where the wine will then be topped and mature in oak for a minimum of 12 months and quite often closer to 2 years, depending on the vintage. And it's a winemaking decision. Do we need more integration? Do we need more oak? Do we need less oak? Do we want more brightness, etc., etc.? So all of that does combine to give eventually what is house style. But the other part I think that is really important when it comes to house style is I went over to the US, and you were talking about seeing us quite frequently, sort of from around about 2017 onwards. We were often spending months and months of the year there in a row. And my colleague that I was over with, Andrew Baldwin, he was going into his 34th consecutive vintage. He's now in his, I think, 37th as we speak. And I remember there was a turning point in the project for us where he and I were really quite obsessive about going over to California and making sure that house style was still maintained. And I turned to him at one point, and it must have been early in 2018, and we were in the region in Napa Valley, and I said to him, instead of making a wine that exudes house style, let's reframe things. By very virtue of the fact that he had 34 consecutive vintage at Penfolds under his belt, I at the time I think had 11. Between the two of us, nearly 45 years of winemaking experience at Penfolds. I said, let's just make the best wine that we can possibly craft. And by very virtue of the fact that we have long apprenticeships, it will always be Penfolds. And as soon as we reframed, I guess, our approach, everything became really, really easy. A little bit like Grange is always the very best wine that we can possibly craft within vintage constraints. We were chasing excellence. And as soon as we started to chase excellence and the best of the best, our craft was always going to ensure that house style and that Penfolds lens was overlaid to what we were doing. And then I guess a distinguished but small portfolio of 4 wines came out of the 2018 Napa vintage or Californian vintage. And Bin 600 is the only wine to be, I guess, appellated as California because we're blending that Paso Robles Shiraz with Napa Valley Cabernet. I didn't even realize that that wasn't even common in California. It seemed so logical for us to go down that path. And I remember speaking to American journalists straight up with this project. And I said, hold up a second. This is actually a concept that's quite unfamiliar for us. But for us, it was the natural thing to do.
I remember a lot of lively conversation around what appellations were going to go on the labels of these bottles, definitely. And we'll talk a little bit later about the wine of the world. But I'm wondering, from our audience, who has comments, questions, thoughts about what we've done here? Because yes, we've been around 177 years, and we have incredible passion around winemaking, but this was a risk. Something we've never done before. And it really illustrates the entire history of Penfolds. Max was doing things he never did before. Obviously, the Penfold family. So who has questions? I want to hear what you think.
What kind of challenges did you run into in Napa that you had never seen before in Australia?
It's a really great question. The first challenge that we hit straight up is obviously we needed fermenters in the region that were like what we were used to using here at home here in Australia. And the picture before of the heading down boards, those concrete open fermenters with heading down boards to submerge the cap, that is not common in Napa. And in fact, I imagine that if we drove up and down the valley from top to bottom and dropped in all wineries along the length of the valley, I would argue that we would struggle to find possibly any wineries that use heading down boards. And if we did find some, I'm guessing you could count them on one hand. Maybe it's one or two that have that as a part of their story. So first of all, we had to make sure that we had a winery that was either retrofitted or custom made to make sure that it was geared towards the Penfolds house style. The other challenge that I found, I guess, going to a different hemisphere is we are often the ones to represent our wines, but I cannot tell you how important the craft is of our cellar workers when it comes to house style, quality, and doing everything the Penfolds way. Here at Penfolds, where I'm sitting at the moment, probably about 100 meters away from me, is a bustling winery where I would suggest there's probably about 50 to 60 cellar members operating as we speak. Those 50 to 60 cellar members sometimes have apprenticeships that are just as long as Andrew Baldwin's, who I spoke about before. And in fact, one of the guys out in the cellar, Lloyd, is actually celebrating his 50th consecutive vintage here at Penfolds.
Wow.
Our cellar team back us at every single move, and a good relationship between winemaking and the cellar crew is crucial to what we do, and it's crucial to success. So going to another hemisphere and I guess not having your usual crew, your cellar crew with you, is a challenge. It's really difficult. And one of the ways around that is we took one of the guys over with us in 2017, I guess, to skill and school some people on the ground over in California with what we needed for 2018 and forevermore. And so I'd say that that was a really big challenge. And the third challenge is more of a philosophical one. The third challenge, I think, is working for a brand that is steeped in tradition. And at that point in time, I think we were 174 years old. We were fast approaching our 175th birthday. It was, how do we respect tradition and house style, but still create new knowledge and something to future-proof ourselves for the next 175 years? And I'm guessing there are many, many industries represented by you guys on the line today. And I would guess that all of you have the exact same conversation with either your own businesses or the industries or the people that you work within. How do you maintain what has given you success to this point in time, but never take it as the status quo and rely on it and stand still? And I guess 2020 was the year that made everyone realize that it can't keep going on the way that they were always going on. This predated 2020, but what it did do is the whole project allowed us to be adventurous. And in some people's minds, that's controversial. And some people feel it's a departure from tradition. But in some ways, I feel like it was the path that we were always meant to be on at the same point in time. There was so much groundwork backing all of this that it wasn't a switch that was flicked. It wasn't something done overnight. And you've got to remember, we were at a point in time from a business point of view where we could not supply the appetite that was out there globally for Penfolds wines. And that is not the reason for us being in the US. The reason was started 20 years beforehand. But from a business point of view, it does give you almost an insurance policy going forward. From a creativity point of view, in my eyes, it keeps all of us engaged and it allows us to capture wines in bottle that the next generation can learn from again, like I learned from so many of the wines that my predecessors put into bottle. So that philosophically was a big challenge. How are you respectful for what the brand stands for? And keep in mind what the brand stands for is embedded in Australian roots, but still operating in another country. That was hard.
Well, and it carries the torch of Max, who
it does.
when we think about Max, and we'll talk about him. If there are no more questions, we can actually just move on to that topic with Bin 389. Does anyone have any other questions that they would like to ask us?
Charlotte, quickly, I just wanted to know, will the wines always be the same percentage blend from Napa, Sonoma, and Paso?
Almost never. And the reason being is that the numbers that we land on are really from taste alone. And so we are never targeting 23%, 22%, 20%, 50%. We are never going after a numerical answer to what a blend should be. The blend is always done by the craft or the skill or the art of taste, sensory assessment, and blending purely by what your palate guides you to do. And what that means is that once you have landed on a blend, it is only after that fact that you look over and see what the paperwork tells you. And the paperwork, of course, contains all the numbers. So for us to land on the exact same percentage again in either the following year or future years, it's possible, but it's unlikely. The odds are always against us. And what I can tell you is that the 2019 is a different percentage again, as is the 2020.
This is going to sound too much like a softball question, but why did you price it so cheap?
Look, I have to say, if you were to think about another industry, fine arts, and you have an exhibition, a public exhibition, you'll generally find the artist is hiding behind the walls because they're too afraid to openly hear what critique or evaluation is going on from the public. You've got to remember that us as winemakers, we quite often feel the same way. We're quite often hiding behind the walls. We've poured our heart and soul into something and we're afraid to hear of what the public critique is. And as a result, you're always going to undersell yourself. The other thing is that an inaugural release happens for a reason. The first of something usually is incredibly purposeful with a reason for being, but also you want to over-deliver in that first year, because this is essentially going to be a part of our story and narrative and history books for the next 175 years. And you want to set yourself up for success if you possibly can.
Do you feel that this wine will lay down for a while?
Everything that Penfolds do is geared around ageability. And I remember somebody said to me recently, given the stats are 98% of all wine that's purchased is consumed within 24 hours, why are you building for the long term? And the best answer I can possibly give is that there are two industries at play here. There is the wine industry, and then there is the fine wine industry. And when it comes to the fine wine industry, the stats are different. And when it comes to the fine wine industry, you want something that is going to be able to be enjoyed immediately on release, but also 10, 20, and in some cases 40 or 50 years down the track. It's a different field. It's a different game. And I would argue that Bin 389 conservatively has 10 years of life in it. In saying that, I often talk about Bin 389 as having 20 years of life in it. Yet there are some beautiful examples of 1960s Bin 389s that are still drinking well today. And we're almost looking at 65 years down the track. So sometimes wines can surprise you, and I would prefer to be conservative with my estimates because I would prefer that you drink a wine too young than too old.
Are you targeting a lot of by the glass kind of on-premise business with this wine?
Absolutely, with Bin 600, absolutely. And what that means is that if your on-premise partners are important for this wine, you need to have approachability on release, because restaurants and the hospitality industry in general, they're usually poor on two things, storage space and cash flow. And what that means is that having them store the wine, sell the wine for you for 10 years is hard by way of their footprint, and it's hard by way of their bank balance too. So approachability is important, and our job as winemakers is to work out how you can achieve approachability on release, but never shave life expectancy off at the other end.
It should also be noted that with this inaugural collection, we've produced a fraction of the wine that we typically do for the Australia range. So while we want to see it in glasses, on tables, on premise, everywhere, that's probably not likely to happen just yet. We'll have to maybe make a few more cases, Steph, on the next one. What do you think?
Bin 389 is so entrenched in Australian wine folklore that, particularly when I'm talking to an Australian crowd, I almost get stopped at every sentence because people have their own emotive attachment with this wine. And to give you some sort of insight about what that means here in Australia, this wine here is actually the country's most collected wine, full stop, often by both value and volume. So to rephrase that statement in another way, I guess if you were to go into any cellar here in Australia, the bottle that you are most likely going to find is Bin 389. I think due to pedigree and track record, people are always assured that you will make it to a 21st milestone, anniversary or celebration with a bottle of Bin 389. And that to a lot of people has given them confidence when they buy it. And I say to people that with all the wines that Penfolds makes, honestly, we pay for them like everybody else as winemakers. We part with our own personal dollars every single time we want to put something into our cellar. And I wish my paycheck was enough to be buying all wines on release every year in the caseload amounts, but even I'm selective myself. And, you know, quite often I'll know the strength of the vintages coming through and I'll tuck certain things away in large quantities in some years. And then the following vintage, I might skip them and wait for another year or two. With 389, it's the one wine that I buy every single year, regardless of vintage. And the reason being is that Bin 389 is probably the most consistent performer in our entire lineup, in our entire portfolio. Here in Australia, it's at around about the $100 price point. And I'm thinking it's similar in the US. Maybe Charlotte does better deals for you than probably what I'm getting. But well, Bin 389 at that price point, knowing that it will always go for a minimum of 21 years and highly likely closer to 30 plus, all of a sudden puts it back into value for money territory, in my opinion. So that is why I guess the emotional attachment that people have with it here in this country is strong. The sellerability and collectability is incredibly strong. It's one of the most traded wines on the secondary market in auctions. You know, they're probably the best external endorsements you could possibly have for this wine. And I know that the US collectors and our US sort of loyalists feel the same way about Bin 389.
So a little bit of backstory, as we were discussing, you know, philosophies and respecting tradition. You know, Max found himself in sort of the same position in 1951 when he came back from France, and he was so inspired, you know, to make a claret, a red wine that would stand the test of time, as we've been discussing here with Bin 389. Bin 389 actually holds the place of being one of his experiments, first vintage 1960. Max faced a couple of hardships. One, he didn't have French oak, which all of the great first growths of France have. And he also didn't have plentiful A-grade Cabernet to work with. So he had American oak and he had Shiraz. And across time, he experimented with how he would blend those and ultimately what the style of Grange would be. But in 1960, with Bin 389, he loved what he did so much with that experiment that it became, you know, a favorite for him, and it became definitely a pillar in the range for the winery that moving forward. And, you know, there's the famous story about how Max was told to stop making Grange and told to go back and focus his energy on fortified wine because that's traditionally what we did. And he didn't do that. He made Grange in secret, and ultimately he was right, and he laid the groundwork for where we are today. And you know, I look at you, Steph, and Andrew and Peter, and I think, you know, it will be so interesting in 75 years what people are talking about and how they will tell the story of how this inaugural collection came about for our present day winemakers, and how that relates back to Bin 389. So, you know, people taking risks with their reputation, with their jobs, with their creativity, but knowing that what they're going to do is inspired and it's the right thing to do because they just know it's the right thing to do. So that's why we actually put these two wines in the box, was to tell that tale. We're super proud of everything relating both to the new collection and, of course, what we do every year with the Australia range. But I think we would be remiss in not covering one other important point about the California collection, and that is the wine of the world. We have other wines in the collection, which I'm sure everyone has seen in some of the communication materials. But Steph, I feel like we need to explain a little bit about what Wine of the World is and kind of how that came about, because it's a pretty interesting story.
Yeah, Bin 600 has two family members, so to speak. And I use that term quite deliberately because usually wines within a portfolio or in a house, they do have a relatedness to each other. And I say to people a little bit like my siblings and I, you can tell that we've come from the same parents. You can tell that we've shared similar DNA. There is a resemblance, but our personalities are so different. And that should be the case when you look at wines like Quantum and Bin 149, which you've just alluded to. They are related to Bin 600. There is a resemblance that comes through as a common thread throughout the whole portfolio. But Bin 149 and Quantum, I guess, have a slightly quirkier or new story. And I guess up on the screen at the moment, you've got those two bottles and you know, Andrew Baldwin on the left, myself in the middle, and our chief winemaker, Peter Gago, on the right. When it came to, I guess, the wines that sit at the top of our Californian family tree, just like Grange, we were chasing the best of the best, as I mentioned before. Really, the rule book goes out the window for many of us at Penfolds when it comes to all decisions of winemaking, as long as we are chasing excellence or heading for quality of the highest level. And at the end of any vintage, we have a classification tasting. And a classification tasting, if it's not obvious to you what it is, it's basically a chance for us to look at over 1 to 2 weeks every single parcel of wine that's come through the winery that vintage. Here in Australia, it will often take you 200 wines a day for maybe 7 or 8 days at a time. Great pictures here. And all of the big decisions are made in classification. And if you were to ask me the most important week in our calendar for the whole year as winemakers, it is this classification tasting. Steve Leanett, second from the left, is the gentleman I spoke to you about before, our previous senior winemaker, who was part of this Californian project. And it really did require that generational passing of information to myself and Andrew Baldwin. When it came to our classification tasting in California from the 2018 vintage, we had sent over with us some samples of 2018 A1 Shiraz and A1 Cabernet, wines of the highest level that we were producing here in Australia, for us as a reference point, really just to make sure the goalposts were where they were meant to be for the California wines that we were working on. And in a way, whilst this was not purposeful, on reflection, I've realized it was always going to happen. Our curiosity was always going to take us to, what does a couple of drops of these A1 Australian parcels look like in our Californian blends? And so we were playing around on the bench with a couple of drops here and a couple of drops there. And what we found, that particularly with Quantum and Bin 149, is that a couple of drops of Australian Shiraz and A1 Australian Cabernet at the highest level changed the dial more than just a couple of percent. And what we had created was almost the glue that bonded these Californian blending companions together, with a tiny amount of Australian wine being represented by way of numbers. Now, the funny thing is that when I talk about this with, in my mind, some of the most conservative wine journalists on the planet, I'm expecting almost a little bit of resistance from them. Purists that might see this as being unnecessary. What I've been surprised with is that almost every single time I talk about the concept, they tell me that they know of a winemaker who has done this first or already. I have no problems in that. We have never claimed to be the first when we were doing this. What I will say is that when we put Wine of the World on the label, I know that we were jumping through legal hoops as being the first to do so. So winemakers had done this before us because they wanted it for their own knowledge. They wanted it for their own curiosity. And I think that that is wonderful because it meant that people had wondered the same thing that we have for so long, but almost every single one of them that has reached out to me since has said we just didn't have the conviction to share it with our loyalists. And I love that we wanted to share this with our consumers, our loyalists, those that were closest to the Penfolds circle, because we felt that there was knowledge and excellence to be experienced. And I guess as a result, they have appreciated being on part of that journey too. I remember being in that classification tasting and saying to a US colleague that we were working with on the ground in California in Napa, if you were to describe the identity of this wine, what would you say? And I expected the response to come back as a nationality. I expected her to say it looks American, or it looks Australian, or it looks Napa Valley, or whatever it might be, Californian. And instead her single word answer was, it looks worldly. And that international sort of approach to what we were doing all of a sudden resonated with me. And I thought about people that are also worldly in their character as being often the most interesting, often the most full of wisdom, with the richest stories to tell. And all of a sudden for me, that was a great reason for being. And what we had created was altogether different, but still entrenched with the same philosophies that have served us here in Penfolds over the previous 175 years. And I remember she said, the other thing is that Californians are an incredibly open-minded bunch of people. And I know that we have many Californians on the call today. And I guess that gave me a little bit of comfort as well. She said, here in Napa, we're a region that's established by a lot of French ownership and French roots. We are a new wine world producing country though. And we have Australians now in the region. And the more diversity, and I guess the more knowledge sharing, the more connectivity in the global wine community that we can have, the better the industry becomes. And so I loved that. We had conviction before her response, but I can tell you now it multiplied it 10 times after hearing it. And so those wine of the worlds, I guess, lead the portfolio at the top of the family tree. And I believe that some of those wines will probably have, 2 to 3 decades of longevity attached to them.
And certainly
Quantum, coming up on the screen now, which is great.
Yes, so you can see 13% Shiraz from, 87% Napa Valley Cabernet and 13% Shiraz from South Australia. So literally combining 2 hemispheres. And then of course, 149 as well, 14.9% of that beautiful Cabernet from right in around Kalimna in
Exactly.
Barossa Valley.
Charlotte, if I may ask, and actually I have a few of our friends here who have been asking a few questions about how to get it. And I know we stretched quite a bit of your inventory, especially with 389. We appreciate, these are heavily allocated wines that you guys were very kind enough to share with our community.
Well, we're special.
Exactly. Well, we are special. But what is the best way for our special community to purchase a few more wines?
Absolutely. So we do have the QR code. If you want to scan that with your phone, if you're on your computer, you can scan it with your phone. Otherwise, penfolds.com will take you via a cookie straight to the US website, depending on where you live. Hopefully, we don't have too many folks from Ohio because Ohio is restricted for everybody. But for the most part, all of these wines you can purchase directly from us, and we can ship them to you in whatever state you live in, hopefully.
Charlotte, do you have some of these in Magnum? We had a couple questions about that.
We don't have any here in the shipping cellar, but Steph, did we make any? I'm not sure.
Yeah, there was a little bit of bin 149 and quantum that was put into Magnum, but tiny amounts. So I don't know if you're not seeing them because they're all gone, or if you're not seeing them because they've been tucked away and allocated for a purpose. So reach out to Tim Irwin and he should be able to help you out.
Okay, yeah, I'll definitely ask him because I haven't seen him. Definitely seen the others.
And so to be clear with anybody who's not familiar with QR codes, all you need to do is hold your camera, your camera up to the barcode that you see on the bottom right here, and it'll pop up the link.
Do you sell in 6-bottle cases or 12-bottle cases?
For us, a case would be 9 LE, so it would be a 12-bottle case. However, you can purchase in any quantity you wish, and we do right now have complimentary ground shipping for the Vices members. If anyone has questions about these wines or needs any assistance in selection, you can also send us an email at rsvp@penfolds.com, and that comes directly to Connor and me. So one or the other of us will be happy to respond.
And as always, we're here to help you with anything you need. support@vices.com is your go-to email for all things. One of the things that we're doing now is we're creating a lot of custom boxes for our members and partners. And so if you wanted to create a custom version of this box or something similar, we can do that. If there's something where you're not finding this wine or you're having trouble, we'll make sure that we help you as your concierge.
And Connor has just put our email in the chat box. And as Dan said, please feel free to reach out to the Vices team as well. And we're happy to do whatever we need to do to get the wine for you. We're thrilled.
Charlotte, have things opened up in Napa? Can we come visit the tasting room?
So the tasting rooms are reopening. Penfolds in the US, everything that we do is private event and by appointment. And as you know, our partnership with you, we certainly make appointments available for Vices members. And again, you can use the RSVP email to make that request. But we are open and entertaining people by appointment. Definitely.
Steph, how are things going in Australia?
Well, I've got good news and bad news for you. In terms of life as normal, it's pretty good here. We don't have any active cases in the community across the country. Everyone who has active COVID cases is in a hotel quarantine. In saying that, I think because we've done such a good job of not having COVID in the community, the vaccination program has been awful and access to it. So look, life feels good. We just obviously have that restriction still being able to move internationally.
It is the earliest opportunity. I'm excited to come visit you guys.
I can't wait. And well, we are also planning on being back in September. So we'll see how we go with that plan, but that is what we are working towards. Can't wait to be back in California soil.
We're looking forward to it.
Great. Now I must head back into the winery. As I said, I've tasted about 200 wines already for the morning, but there's probably about another 100 waiting for the rest of the day. So I will get a move on, but guys, thank you for your support. Thank you for jumping on the call. Honestly, this is the better part of my job. I love jumping online, listening to the questions, thoughts on the wine, and of course, sharing it. It's what it's made for. But enjoy the rest of your evening and only one more day to the weekend. We're almost there.
Bravo, Steph.
This is
wonderful. Thank you for joining us.
A pleasure. Night, guys. Bye.